In this segment, we'll be discussing exposure while taking pictures in various lighting situations. It's very important that the correct amount of light is allowed to enter your camera to record the image. Proper exposure is the most important thing you can do to make your photographs look better. One of the most important elements of exposure is ISO. We'll be taking pictures of this tricycle as we learn how ISO affects the exposure of your images. We'll take some pictures in the bright sun and some pictures in the shade. As we do this, we'll learn how the ISO should be changed as the lighting conditions change. The amount of light required to record the image is determined by your film speed, or ISO. Digital cameras still have the same concept as film speed. On your digital camera, ISO refers to the image sensor's sensitivity to light. Some ISO settings react very quickly to light and need very little exposure to capture the image. These ISOs are good for photographing indoors and in lower light situations. Other ISO settings are very slow to react to light and require more exposure to record the image. These ISOs are good for photographing outside in bright sunshine. You can set the sensitivity of your camera's image sensor with the ISO setting. The ISO can be set for a variety of situations and is measured in numbers like 100, 200, 400, 800, and 1600. The higher numbers will be more sensitive to light and require less exposure or light to get to the sensor. The lower numbers are less sensitive and require more light to get to the sensor for a proper exposure. With film cameras, we were stuck with a single ISO setting for the entire roll of film because the ISO is the speed of the film. You could not change your ISO setting in the middle of a roll if the lighting situation changed. With digital cameras, we can easily change the ISO setting with every shot with only a simple change in the camera. This allows the photographer more freedom to take pictures without the need to stay in similar lighting situations. You can freely move from bright sunlight to dimly lit situations, and with a quick adjustment to your ISO setting, you can keep taking well-exposed photos. Higher ISO numbers indicate a higher sensitivity to light. The image will be recorded much faster and needs less exposure. This is great for photographing in areas with very little light, like indoors or heavily shaded areas. You may wonder why we would ever use a lower ISO, since higher ISOs provide more flexibility because they're more sensitive to light. The drawback to using higher ISO settings is that they introduce more digital noise into the image. Digital noise is how we describe the undesirable grainy appearance of a digital image. Noise or grain looks like tiny dots of random colors in an otherwise even area on the photo. Photographs taken with a high ISO setting will appear less sharp than those taken with a low ISO setting. It's important that images are as clear as possible. For this reason, you'll always want to use the lowest ISO setting you can, but still get proper exposure. Proper exposure is the most important thing to make your image quality as high as possible. Never underexpose an image because you didn't want to increase your ISO. A well-exposed image taken with a higher ISO will always look better than an underexposed image taken with a lower ISO setting. Lower ISO settings will produce a much higher quality image but require more light to record the image. Image quality is important, especially when you plan on enlarging your photographs. They may look clear on your camera's LCD screen, but when you make a print, you may realize that a photograph taken with a high ISO setting is more grainy than you thought. To keep your images as sharp as possible, you should use the lowest ISO possible. So how do you know which ISO to use? Well, here's a guide that can help you. It's also on your photography tips card, so it's okay if you don't remember all this right now. If you're shooting pictures outdoors in full sun, you'll want to set your camera to a fairly low ISO setting, between 1 and 200. You'll want to use ISO 400 if you're taking pictures outdoors in the shade or on a cloudy day. ISO 400 is also good for indoor photos with plenty of window light. And if you're shooting action pictures or pictures in poor lighting conditions, you'll want to use a very high ISO of about 800 to 1600. Now let's take a few pictures of this tricycle, and as you can see, we're outdoors in a very well lit area. Since there's a lot of sunlight, we'll set the ISO to a very low number, 100. If we use this ISO setting, the image will retain its clarity and crisp detail, which will create more visual interest. Now let's take a few more pictures of this tricycle, and as you can see, we've moved to a heavily shaded area of the yard and there isn't as much sunlight. We'll need to change the ISO to a higher number to get a properly exposed image, so let's set the ISO to 800. When we see both of the photos of the tricycle side by side, we can clearly see the difference in the clarity between the shots taken with ISO 100 and the shots taken with ISO 800. However, it's important to note that the shot of the tricycle in the shade would have been much too dark if the ISO had been a lower number. ISO, aperture, and shutter speed all work together to help you get proper exposure. The right combination of those three controls will ensure that you have maximum detail in your images every time you take a photograph. Make sure you always check your light meter with every shot you take. By checking your light meter and making the proper adjustments to your ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed settings, you can have a well-exposed shot every time. The best way to master these controls is to get out and photograph as much as possible. Take lots of photos and try making lots of adjustments to your settings. With digital cameras, you can learn these controls much more quickly because you can see your results immediately. Get out with your camera and have fun. The more photos you take, the better photographer you'll become.